Hello, class. Professor Mandeville here. This is lecture number 4 for History 101. And we're going to pick up where we left off last time. We're going through this chronicle of colonial and British tension, and we had got to the repeal of the Townshend Revenue Acts, which occurred in March 1770. Something that's not on this handout is another significant event that took place in March of 1770. That event is the infamous Boston Massacre. Now, let me explain the background information related to the Boston Massacre of March of 1770. Previously, we had talked about how the King George III refused to release soldiers from the British Army, and that Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which made the colonists responsible for the room and board of these soldiers when they were stationed in the colonies. As time went on, more and more soldiers were coming to the colonies because the colonists had to pay their room and board. Many of them ended up in Boston. So what's going to happen here is Boston is going to be overflowing with British soldiers. So much so, they're going to have to set up a giant campground in the Boston Commons. Those of you who have been to Boston before know what the Boston Commons are. They're sort of a miniature version of Central Park in New York City. In the center of the city, they've been there from the beginning. They're still utilized by Bostonians today as a place to have their lunches on a nice day. Events take place there and so forth. Well, all that comes to a screeching halt in 1770 because it's a British campground, and Bostonians aren't happy. Another related factor to all these troops being in Boston is many of them are doing what's known as moonlighting. They're taking on extra jobs during their off-duty hours, working for local businesses in Boston like restaurants, stores, and so forth, cleaning them up in the middle of the night when they're closed and when these guys are off duty. They're trying to make some extra money because obviously the pay for British soldiers back then was not very significant. Now, what this causes is unemployed young Bostonian men. Those are the men who used to do these jobs, but now the redcoats are doing the jobs because they're more reliable workers. So what happens from time to time, these gangs of young guys and also some of the Sons of Liberty get into harmless confrontations with British troops as they march around the city on maneuvers. And in the wintertime, these turn into snowball battles. Young guys would charge out of an alley after redcoats marched by, pelt them with snowballs, and it was pretty harmless. But in March of 1770, a snowball battle turned horribly wrong. It was a typical scene as was done before in the streets of Boston. A snowball battle occurred between young Bostonians and British troops. But this time, when the smoke cleared, 5 young Bostonian males lay dead. Another 6 were wounded because the British opened fire on these young guys who, as we'll talk about, claim they were unarmed. So obviously, as in most cases, there are 2 sides to the story. According to the British redcoats and their testimony in the court trial that ensued, these were no normal snowballs that were being thrown at them. They had rocks inside them. And many of them were being hit in the head with these. They told these young men to cease and desist. When they refused, they claim one of these young Bostonians pulled a gun and they fired in self-defense. Now, the young Bostonians' version of the story, they admit that they put chunks of ice in these snowballs they were throwing at the troops, obviously, which in a snowball battle is cheating. From what I remember when I was a kid, you didn't put chunks of ice in a snowball unless you wanted to get your butt kicked. And when the Troops told them to stop. They didn't wait. They opened fire on them. And they claimed that they were all unarmed. Now, what really happened in this event, I guess we'll never know. There was a trial that happened after. The troops are found not guilty, no surprise. But what really happens out of this event is the Sons of Liberty, that rebel group that's been organizing the boycotts and really unwittingly preparing for a rebellion, use this as the perfect propaganda situation. When these 5 young men are buried, there's a funeral procession that goes through the entire town, and the whole town mourns for them, obviously. But then, as the word spreads about this Boston Massacre, as it's known, now let's think about that for a second. Is the killing of 5 people really considered a massacre? Well, in the colonies back in 1770, that's what it became. Because as the word spread from colony to colony, and remember, there's no television, there's no news coverage, nothing like that. It's word of mouth, basically. The story got larger and larger and larger. And I'm sure by the time it made it to Georgia, hundreds of Bostonians were murdered in cold blood by bloodthirsty British redcoats. Blood was spilled in the streets and probably ran into the Boston Harbor as the story went by the time it made it through all the southern colonies. This was an event utilized by the Sons of Liberty as a prime propaganda opportunity. And that happens in society. So now we want to move back to our handout. The next thing on there, as you'll notice, is the Tea Act. The Tea Act was passed in May of 1773 by Parliament. And basically what it did, as you can see in the provisions on your handout, it gave the East India Company exclusive rights to sell tea directly in the colonies. The British East India Company was a company that had hit hard times, and really the main purpose of this law, it's a government bailout, like we're seeing today, for the airline industry. The East India Company was on hard times because tea sales had dropped significantly, especially during the boycott of the Townshend Revenue Acts. Colonists just weren't buying it. So what it did is it eliminated middlemen, allowed the East India Company to ship their tea from Asia directly to the colonies, and let only East India Company shops sell tea in the colonies. Now, on top of that, it actually lowered the duties or taxes on tea for the colonists. So when Parliament passed this in May of 1773, they were really happy with themselves. They thought it was a brilliant piece of legislation, a win-win. It would save the East India Company. It would appease the colonists because the price of tea would drop, and they really thought they were brilliant. Well, lo and behold, that's not how it happened. What it did was put colonial businessmen out of business. A shop that relied on selling tea owned by a colonist couldn't sell tea anymore. Only East India Company shops could. And this caused all hell to break loose in the colonies. Now, one thing that occurs, some cities like New York just flat out refused to allow East India Company ships to dock at the Port of New York, refused them entrance and said, "Get out of here, we don't want your tea." In Boston, they kind of dropped the ball. A ship from the East India Company came into port, docked, and it was loaded with tea from Asia, ready to stock the stores in Boston. The mayor of Boston went down and told the captain of the ship, you can't unload your cargo, and in fact, you might as well go back where you came from. We don't want your tea. The captain of the ship said, I only take orders from the British government, and I've heard nothing from them. So that ship just sat there in the Boston harbor for weeks with its tea on board and nowhere to go because they wouldn't let it unload. Now, this really antagonized Bostonians, who were the most radical groups anyway. And on the night of December 16th, 1773, a group of the Sons of Liberty, dressed up like Mohawk Indians. Why they dressed like Mohawks, beyond me. The Mohawks don't live anywhere near Boston, but they did. Went on board the ship and threw 340 wooden chests of tea into Boston's harbor. This is the famous Boston Tea Party. Now, when Bostonians woke up the next morning, these 340 chests of tea are bobbing around in the Boston harbor. Bostonians are celebrating and so forth. Well, two groups weren't celebrating. One, the East India Company. That meant to them they just lost 10,000 pounds sterling worth of tea that was ruined by it being thrown in the Boston harbor. In today's money, that's the equivalent of about $500,000. The British government was furious also. So what they're going to do in response to the Boston Tea Party is the next thing on our handout. They're going to pass the Coercive Acts. I'm going to explain to you what the Coercive Acts are first. Then you'll notice in parentheses underneath Coercive Acts is the term Intolerable Acts. I'll explain to you what that means also momentarily. But first, the Coercive Acts. The Coercive Acts were passed by Parliament between March and June 1774 in response to the Boston Tea Party. And what they do is set up the following punishments for Boston and the colony of Massachusetts that will stay in effect until somebody steps forward and pays the 10,000 pounds sterling, the value of that tea that was ruined in Boston Harbor. So the first thing it does is it closes the port of Boston, which shuts it off from any trade. Sounds like a really severe thing, but what you have to realize is another very thriving port city was not too far from Boston. That's Salem, Massachusetts. Its port rivaled Boston, and it was still open. So what this amounted to was a major inconvenience for Bostonian business people. They had to have their goods shipped to Salem, then transport them by land, by wagon and horse, to Boston, which added a lot of expense. But it's not like Boston was shut off from the world. The second thing that happened was a reorganization of the Massachusetts colonial legislature. Previously, before the Coercive Acts, it was a two-house legislature. One house elected by colonists, the other house appointed by the King of England. The house elected by colonists was eliminated, and now it's a one-house legislature with all appointees of the king. Another part of the Coercive Acts, it limited Boston to one town meeting per year. Typically, Boston would have these meetings almost monthly, like common council meetings in cities across America today. And what would also happen at these Boston town meetings, the Sons of Liberty would show up and get their messages across to people in Boston as to what's new in the revolutionary activities of their group. So the British government limited that to one meeting per year, basically telling them you better do your city business. There'll be no time for Sons of Liberty at these meetings. And another part of the so-called Coercive Acts was that it called for all Brits who were charged with a crime in the colonies, like those soldiers who had been charged with the crimes of the Boston Massacre, instead of being tried in the colonies, they would either be shipped back to England or up to British Canada for trial. So this basically was a signal to colonists. Brits were going to have carte blanche as far as crime in the colonies. They wouldn't be punished. And finally, what it did, it replaced the royal governor of Massachusetts with a military governor. General Gage, a redcoat general, was now put in charge of the colony of Massachusetts. So all these would stay in place until somebody paid for the tea from the Boston Tea Party. Well, guess what? No one ever paid for that tea, so these will remain in place until April of 1775, when the Rev War starts outside of Boston at Lexington and Concord. Now, as I mentioned before, in parentheses under Coercive Acts is the term Intolerable Acts. This is a term that colonists routinely referred to the Coercive Acts and another set of acts, the Quebec Acts, combined. So now let me explain to you what the Quebec Acts are all about. The Quebec Acts were passed for all the citizens living in British Canada, in the Quebec region. Now, after the French and Indian War, the British feared that Quebec City, Montreal would be hotbeds for rebellion. These are all former French citizens who stayed there after the war, and now all of a sudden they're British subjects. How exactly is this going to work? Surprisingly, to the British, nothing happened. These former French citizens, now British subjects, basically behaved themselves. So they wanted to reward them. So the Quebec Acts were passed. What they do is, first of all, they will give the French Canadians the ability to follow French civil law instead of British civil law. That's person-to-person law and so forth. And basically what they're saying is there's no need to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to adopt British civil laws like marriage, divorce, and things like that. You can keep your own set of laws. It also set up a official government in British Canada. They'd been under military occupation, so now it set up a government, and what it set up was a system where they had a royal governor appointed by the king and a one-house legislature with all of its members appointed by the King of England. Now, that combined with the Coercive Acts is sort of seen as the writing on the wall by the colonists, that sooner or later all the colonies will have their elected legislative bodies dissolved by the British government. Now, this was no big deal to French Canadians. That's the same system they had under the French king, so it really didn't change. And the final thing that was really a slap in the face, especially to Puritans and Pilgrims in Massachusetts, it officially recognized the Catholic Church as the Church of British Canada. It only made sense. All the French who settled there were basically Catholics. But remember the animosity between Puritans, Pilgrims, and Catholics. This was a slap in the face to those Protestants in Massachusetts. So the Quebec Acts and the Coercive Acts were collectively known as the Intolerable Acts by the colonists. So, what's going to happen next? Things will really start to heat up in Massachusetts especially, but throughout the colonies. In response to the intolerable acts, the very first Continental Congress will meet in September of 1774 in Philadelphia. Now, this is an unofficial meeting, obviously, but the word spread through the organization of the Sons of Liberty. 12 out of the 13 colonies send representatives to this meeting, and basically what they decide to do is have an all-out boycott on England. Now, we remember, in the past, they had boycotted British-made goods, didn't buy them, and it worked effectively to eliminate the Stamp Act and the Townshend Revenue Acts. But they're going to go a drastic step further this time. They're going to refuse to sell the British anything. The British industrialists were equally dependent on raw materials from the colonies as they were selling manufactured goods to the colonies. So this is sort of the double whammy, if you want to call it that. This is very drastic because what it really means is they're going to have to sell it to other European countries. And as far as the British are concerned with their mercantilist system, that's smuggling. And the people that are going to take part in this are colonial people that own ships known as privateers. They are going to risk their lives smuggling goods to Europe to carry on this full-fledged, double-edged sword boycott. And that's all going to start after the meeting of the Continental Congress in September of 1774. Now, that's where we're going to leave off for now. We'll be picking up with that very last act, the Prohibitory Act. But next, what we're going to carry on to is the beginning of the Revolutionary War and how it really quickly heats up right in our backyard, the North Country. So, that's it for lecture number 4 for History 101. I'll be recording lecture number 5 today also. So, hope you're all safe and sound. Follow the governor's orders and stay home, please. We are going to stop the spread of COVID-19 in the North Country for sure. Take care. Bye.